So this is a fantastic question. The answer is sort of. Now, just because we do not originally contextualize something as traumatic in the moment does not mean it isn't traumatic. And this is where things get a little complicated between our understanding and our narrative things as well as what's actually happening to us. So for example, a lot of people who are in the evangelical church do not view what's being done to them by the church as abuse. And yet, through the understanding of autonomy and consent and shame and what we understand about that objectively, scientifically, when we look at that compared to their perception of it, that doesn't mean they're not being traumatized. And so just because you're not aware that you're being traumatized does not mean you're not being traumatized. Just because you have a narrative that excuses something doesn't mean it's not actually causing you harm. Which is where we get into some complexities about all of this. Because when we look at the fact that if you are experiencing something like a roller coaster, your body's getting this endorphin flood, right? And you are able to intellectually understand that you were not in an environment that was truly risky, you are contextualizing it. So you do not feel like you have to cope with that. Also, a roller coaster is a one-time thing, like you have a day of that. You still would have a biochemical fallout probably the day after you went to an amusement park. You would have fewer endorphins available after flooding yourself by going to ride after ride, right? The same way that somebody will have activation and elation based off of any event, planning for a wedding. Even when it's your own wedding and you want this to happen, it's very often creating stress, and that stress creates a sort of heightened amount of adrenal and biochemical flooding. That's why a lot of people get really depressed right after a big event like going to Dragon Con or a convention of any kind or a big meeting or some other kind of thing, whether it's something you anticipate or something you're dreading. After that event, you have all of the floods that have happened during the event dropping out. And so you have post-event drop, or event drop as a lot of people call it. That event drop is really normal because you've had a biochemical flood. But why is it not traumatic? It's not traumatic for a couple of reasons. One is original context. You, when you went to the amusement park, were seeking that kind of thrill. You, when you went on this date, were seeking to have some kind of experience of romance or excitement or contextualized baselines. And even something like having butterflies may be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your own chemistry, your own history, and the context that it's happening, right? It's really hard to generalize because trauma is a very individualized thing. We can understand that when your autonomy is taken away, when it is something that is very much not able to be contextualized or excused, that is beyond your ability to cope with. But just because something could be perceived as a traumatic event doesn't mean the person experiences it traumatically. And this is where we have to understand what is adverse to one person and is within their ability to cope is traumatic to another person. So the example I always give is the idea of your car breaking down. Your car breaking down is not typically considered to be a traumatic event, but we have to talk about trauma as something that is beyond your ability to cope with, right? And that involves your narrative in your head as well as the extenuating context. If you're going on a roller coaster, the entire context is that you are seeking out that sensation. And so there is a part of that that is good and desired and wanted, and so you got what you wanted out of it. Whereas breaking down on the side of the road is potentially stressful to anybody, right? I'm not getting where I want to on time. I now have to deal with the logistics of getting a rental car or AAA or whatever else is going to happen, or calling somebody or getting a ride or blah, 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 blah. Now, even with the adversity of that event, it's not inherently traumatic. But it might be traumatic for somebody if, for example, they lived in their car and they had no one to call and there was no resources for them. There was nobody to call, there was no money to fix this, and this is including everything that they own. Now that one place that they have that is their home is now not working on the side of the road and they know is going to get towed, they can't stay there anymore, that's not a place they can go, and they don't have any money to fix the car. See how that context shifts enough that it becomes too much to handle very rapidly. So the car breaking down on the side of the road isn't inherently traumatic, but it is something that could be traumatic in a given context. Similarly, something that we can look at, like being held captive and having no autonomy for yourself, is something that absolutely can be traumatizing no matter how much you have tools to contextualize it, right? So being held captive and truly having no control over the situation. I don't mean some quinky stuff where you have safe words. I mean truly having no control over the situation. Even if you know, like in the SERE training, even if you know that this is a simulated event, that can still cause trauma. Basic training for the military can cause trauma, but it is meant to cause trauma in a controlled environment in which they are preparing your mind to deal with this. And so in some ways you are intentionally traumatizing people to create an effect, group kind of cohesiveness, a sense of loyalty, a sense of belonging, a sense of earning your place in an environment, which goes into the social, psychology of environments like this. But we're also looking at the idea of contextualization as, where does this fit in our narrative? The military tells you that this, basic training is part of your earning your space. It is traumatizing, but it's not traumatizing in the sense that you knew that it was a simulation. You can put it in place with your larger service in the military. You can contextualize it as not actually having the real risk of a real firefight, whereas you wouldn't have that if you actually went downrange, because their limitations aren't there in that environment, right? And sometimes even knowing what happened and being able to contextualize it isn't going to stop it from being trauma to you, because it was beyond your ability to cope with. Especially if you had to do things that shattered your sense of self, your sense of identity, your sense of belonging, any of the things that are the fundamental pillars of who you are and how you see yourself. If you are shattered because of an experience, that is more likely to be traumatic regardless of how you contextualize it, because it has taken some aspect of how you see yourself and cracked that fundamentally. So that's where we talk about like moral woundedness, where people have had to act in ways that they believe are unethical, that they would have never believed themselves capable of doing things in extreme circumstances. For example, where they had to take the life of someone else to save someone else, or that they had to do something extreme and that is not within their own sense of ethics, and now they have moral injury based off of this. That is still going to cause trauma regardless of the necessity and framework of understanding that situation in a narrative. So things can be traumatic even if you can contextualize it. Things can be traumatic even if you don't realize they're traumatic in the moment, because you have a contextualization where this is normalized. For example, fundamentalist Christian churches, where this manipulation and these evocation of emotion, like in Cry Nights, are considered to be feeling the spirit, when in fact it is a lot of ambiance being used to manipulate a person. So contextualization does play a part. It's absolutely part of how we will see the event, and it can help us in processing of trauma, to do narrative therapy and understand where this belongs in our experience of the world, in our character arc, as it was in terms of ourselves as the main character. We can do a lot of things to help us in terms of creating a context in which this is part of our greater story and only one part of our story, but at the same time it doesn't stop it from being traumatic in a lot of instances, right? It doesn't stop that it caused a chemical flood that was traumatic in the moment. So even when we do have a contextualization, it doesn't always stop something from being traumatic. For example, going on a roller coaster ride and having that ride actively stop or have a break or a failure, that's then moved from something you sought out in fun to now being contextualized as absolute trauma, right? Which may keep you from ever going on a roller coaster ride again, which we've seen those kinds of failures in the news, right? So that kind of thing actually going wrong, no matter how you contextualize it, may still be beyond your ability to cope, and then be moving from an area of adverse event to actual trauma, because that's the individual's ability to cope and handle that situation and that stress at the intensity it is for them, is when something moves from adversity into trauma for a person.